Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season, part 2. As I talk about my number 11 through 20th ranked wide receivers, giving you guys my perspective and opinions as to how I think the wide receiver position currently stacks up. Of course, we'll talk about players from various teams and the statistics that justify my thought process going into the 2020 season. But we have to remember that rankings are always subject to change. Again, there are 3.5 weeks until the actual beginning of the season, Thursday Night Football between the defending champ Tampa Bay Buccaneers and Dallas Cowboys. There's a lot of time between now and then, and whether these rankings are potentially going to change due to injuries, players being brought into teams, released, cut, doesn't matter. There's a lot of things to keep in mind. So again, rankings are subject to change. Now, if you're trying to stay up to date with my rankings, make sure you subscribe to this channel. For the entirety of the 2021 season, we're going to be making off-season content, a lot of rankings coming up with strength of schedules, tier lists, all of the above for every single position. So keep an eye out for that. And subscribe to the channel. Make sure you click that bell notification button. Now, for those of you who have already subscribed, I cannot thank you guys enough for the incredible support, liking, commenting down below, joining the Discord server down in the description of the video, and of course, being a part of the community and helping grow this every single year, every single season. So thank you once again. Also, a quick shout out to those of you guys who have joined the Patreon and supporting me there. Down in the description of the video, many of you guys can find the Patreon link where I'll be doing a lot of content besides the channel this off season, giving you guys the edge over your fantasy football league. So if that interests you, please support the channel that way. Of course, my 2021 fantasy football draft guide comes out this upcoming Monday, August 16th. So for those of you guys who are interested there, trying to get an advantage on your league, find my flex rankings and all of the above, that is where you can find it. Now that we've gone ahead and covered that, we can talk about my number 20th ranked wide receiver for the 2021 fantasy football season. Again, all of these rankings are for a half PPR system, meaning everyone in the middle who plays in a standard and a full PPR. We're talking about Tyler Lockett as my number 20. Now, Tyler Lockett has been consistent over the last 3 seasons, and that's undeniable. And the thing that I continue to see as I broke down his statistics was I think Tyler Lockett might be the Joe Mixon of the wide receiver position. And the thought process behind that is a lot of people are undervaluing Tyler Lockett. I know he burnt a lot of teams in the second half of the 2020 season, but so did Joe Mixon, and they have the similarities of both being given incredible opportunities and going into the 2021 season relatively undervalued. So the thing I wanted to go ahead and kind of present to you guys was the overall opportunity that Tyler Lockett has seen and why his overall productivity from said opportunity is something that we just can't deny. Again, I mention it every single time I talk about fantasy football. Opportunity leads to success. Anytime you are given an opportunity to touch the ball, your fantasy point total is eventually going to go up. It is just a natural fact by numbers that anytime you touch the ball, your points are going up. And anytime we could see more opportunities for a wide receiver like Tyler Lockett that back in 2018 only had 71 total targets and 57 total receptions, yet he finished as the number 15 wide receiver. But that's not where he stopped. He continued to grow on that opportunity and get more exposure in this offense and deliver on it. After finishing as the number 15 overall wide receiver in 2018, finished as the 14 in 2019, and this last season broke the top 10, was the number 9 overall ranked wide receiver. And I understand he burnt a lot of teams in the second half. I've heard it. I've seen it in the comment sections. You don't have to tell me. I started him for majority of those second halves of the seasons, hoping for the pop-off game, and then it finally arrived in week 17 when no one was playing. That just seems like something Tyler Lockett would do to us last season, but I think the exposure to opportunity is just far too valuable to kind of pass up on. Looking at the last 3 seasons in terms of targets, he went from 71 to 110 to 132, despite, of course, DK Metcalf being a huge part of the offense last season. His reception totals accordingly, of course, went up to from 57 to 82, and then this past season broke 100 total receptions. And in his touchdown counts, the thing that has really made Tyler Lockett is he has had 10 plus touchdowns in 2 out of the last 3 seasons, finishing with 10, 8, and 10. Now, the reason why I have him as my number 20th overall wide receiver, despite this opportunity and the touchdown prowess that he's shown, is that I do expect to see some regression in terms of the touchdown total. Last season, he had 6 receiving touchdowns from inside the 5-yard line. A lot of those touchdowns could have gone to other receivers and or the running back position, but of course, Chris Carson was injured for a majority of the year, having only played 11 full games for the Seattle Seahawks. If you add Chris Carson into this offense, maybe they hand him off the ball. Maybe he ends up scoring half of those touchdowns, and we see a little bit of regression from Tyler Lockett, and that's what I'm anticipating. In the last 2 seasons alone, he's of course seen 40 total red zone targets for 15 receiving touchdowns. Those are fine. I'm just going to give that to him. He's earned those. Certainly. And this offense scores a consistent amount down in the red zone because of how good Russell Wilson has been and how much attention, of course, Chris Carson, DK Metcalf pull from Tyler Lockett. But I do think there is a potential of a little bit of regression in the receiving touchdown game. Outside of that, he could end up even seeing more overall targets in this offense, more receptions, and the yardage count having surpassed 1,000 receiving yards in back-to-back seasons could stand true. And with the new offensive coordinator, with Shane Waldron from the Los Angeles Rams, we know how much they like to use the slot position in terms of Cooper Kupp. The Seahawks might be able to go ahead and expand upon Tyler Lockett's role, give him more opportunities, and have himself be a pretty solid wide receiver to this upcoming season. The fact that Tyler Lockett finished as a top 10 wide receiver last season was a surprise for many of us, but I honestly blame the rest of the wide receiver position. Because the other guys couldn't jump up and finish at a higher standing because they just couldn't score as many fantasy points, and Tyler Lockett had a 45-point game last year, I absolutely see regression. The opportunity is there, and we shouldn't ignore that. That's Tyler Lockett for you at number 20. We move on to our number 19 ranked wide receiver, Cooper Kupp. I've talked about him a little bit this offseason already when I talked about a couple wide receivers in the mid rounds that I'd like to draft. Cooper Kupp has been fantastic for the Los Angeles Rams in the last couple seasons. Since 2018, with Jared Goff as a starting quarterback, he's averaged 13.16 fantasy points per game. Those are great numbers, but last year there was a little bit of a dip. Similar to Tyler Lockett, he burnt a lot of people in the second half of the season, and that was unfortunate, finishing as only the number 27 wide receiver. But I still have Cooper Kupp as a promising start this upcoming season and potentially finishing within the wide receiver 2 range or higher because of the change at the quarterback position. When you inject Matthew Stafford into the Los Angeles Rams offense, I think everyone as a whole improves. And it wasn't that long ago that Cooper Kupp was the number 4 overall wide receiver in fantasy and a half PPR scoring format. And that was back in 2019, where he had 94 receptions for 1,161 receiving yards and 10 receiving touchdowns. The only other player that season to surpass double-digit touchdowns besides Cooper Kupp at the wide receiver position was Kenny Golladay. So again, Cooper Kupp has shown that he can absolutely be a monster at the wide receiver position. He just needs the opportunity, and he needs the offense to at least excel to the next level for him to get more exposures down in the red zone and more opportunities there. Speaking of red zone opportunities, the fact that he saw 7 less touchdowns this last season was mainly because he saw 8 less total targets down in the red zone, and that certainly is going to play a role. If in fact 8 targets could have led to an extra 2 or 3 touchdowns, Cooper Kupp wouldn't have been as much of a volatile play last season, and he wouldn't have kind of left that bad taste in many of our mouths going into the 2021 season. But I do see that there is going to be a potential promising season here in 2021, but I'm not taking it over the top. I think the number 19 spot is a pretty safe position for him as of right now. And when I looked at what Matthew Stafford has done with the slot position when he was with the Detroit Lions, between 2014 to 2017, he had a slot specialist in the name of Golden Tate. We all know Golden Tate is a fantastic wide receiver. He had himself a pretty good career. In those 4 seasons together, the combination of Matthew Stafford with Golden Tate got Golden Tate some pretty good averages. He averaged 93 receptions, 132 targets, 1,056 receiving yards, and 5 receiving touchdowns a season in that 4-year span. If you can go ahead and see Cooper Kupp potentially producing those numbers, maybe get a little bit of an increase in that touchdown range, if in fact they can find him down in the red zone, if Tyler Higbee isn't that big of a monster, I think Cooper Kupp can be an absolutely solid wide receiver this year. That's where I kind of see him producing, and that's why I have him as my number 19. I think this offense takes the next step forward and ends up producing some good numbers. We can go ahead and move on to our next wide receiver here. Number 18, Julio Jones, newly of the Tennessee Titans. Of course, he's still wearing an Atlanta Falcons jersey in this image, but Julio Jones needs to be respected. I'm telling you guys, in the 3rd round, I have no problem taking Julio Jones. In the 4th round, it's an absolute steal. Let's just kind of put it into perspective just how good Julio Jones has been and why. I just don't understand why. Everyone has kind of already written him off as a wide receiver that's, he's past his prime, it's over. Guys, prior to this last year, prior to the injury, Julio Jones was an unstoppable force, finishing as the number 3, 5, 6, 5, 2, and 8 overall wide receivers in consecutive seasons from 2019 to 2014. So within that span, of course, he was a wide receiver 1 and a top 5 at that 4 out of the last 6 seasons. On top of that, prior to his injury, he had only missed 4 of the 96 games that he had played between 2014 to 2019. So he played 92 of 96 games. Where's the injury history? I don't see it. Yet a lot of people want to think, Julio's past his prime. This is a Hall of Fame legendary wide receiver. Okay, the fact that we get to watch him every Sunday is a privilege. But a lot of people are writing him off because, he's going to the Tennessee Titans. There's not enough targets to be had there. Julio Jones isn't great. Julio Jones is a different beast, but the same animal. That's the Kobe quote from the commercial. Anyway, Julio Jones in the last 10 seasons with the Atlanta Falcons has averaged 163 targets a year, 105 receptions, 1,591 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns, and 255 fantasy points in a 16-game season if you expanded his numbers across 16 games. We know Julio Jones is an unstoppable force. This is just a given. Now that we've established it, there it is. But the question remains, where does he fit into this Tennessee Titans offense? Of course, we have Derrick Henry pulling pressure as defenses stack the box with 9 defenders and still can't stop him. We have A.J. Brown on the outside that is a touchdown fiend and scoring every single week and is a huge part of this offense. You have Ryan Tannehill that's playing the best football of his entire career in the last, 24 games? I think it's 26 games. I mean, this offense is looked prime. They're going to change their offensive coordinator, and that's perfectly fine. But when you bring Julio into this offense, it is going to be Julio's offense as a whole because he's going to be pulling a lot of pressure in his direction. And if he's not, if defenses want to stack the box, if defenses want to give A.J. Brown some respect, and you're going to leave Julio Jones with one wide receiver coverage, which he's very rarely seen in his entire career, he's going to torch you. I mean, just last season against Minnesota, let's not forget, he had a game in which he had 8 catches for 137 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. It wasn't that long ago that Julio Jones was murking teams. Now that he comes into the Tennessee Titans, they're like, there's not enough passes to go around. They only throw the ball 480 times. Jonnu Smith's not there. Corey Davis is not there. That's 157 vacant targets. Dude, Julio Jones is primed for a fantastic season. And though I don't see the touchdown numbers being as high because, of course, Derrick Henry down in the red zone, A.J. Brown's a touchdown fiend, and Ryan Tannehill has the mobility down in the red zone to be able to take the ball and score by himself. Just like in Atlanta, we didn't have to guarantee touchdowns for Julio because the receiving yards and the receptions did it. From 2014 to 2019, the guy was averaging 102 receiving yards per game. That accompanied with some receptions and a half PPR with the occasional touchdown, you got yourself a solid wide receiver too. That's why I have him as my number 18, and he could honestly finish higher. A lot of people look at this last season and think, he's injury prone, this, and that. I think A.J. Brown and him on a singular team makes it very difficult for defensive coordinators to prepare every week. I don't think there's a single secondary in the National Football League that could really bottle these guys up. Maybe the Patriots if Stephon Gilmore's full go and the lockdown corner we anticipate him being. That's the only team. Luckily for the Tennessee Titans, I don't know if they even play them this year, but that would just be one game. They're not even in the same division. So again, Julio Jones, stud wide receiver. Take a look at him. The consistency's there, and the opportunity will certainly be. We can go ahead and move on to our number 17 overall wide receiver, Amari Cooper of the Dallas Cowboys. Now, there are two sides of the coin. There's Amari Cooper with Dak Prescott last season, and there was Amari Cooper with Dalton, DiNucci, Gilbert. I mean, it's a completely different category. The quarterback play, the team as a whole was not the same, and there are numbers that absolutely speak volumes in the separation of talent at the quarterback position. It is just profound just how much of a difference there was between an actual good quarterback throwing you the ball and backups and guys that should be on practice squads, to be honest. So let's kind of take it into account. From weeks 1 through 4 with Dak Prescott as the starting quarterback prior to the injury, Amari Cooper had 37 receptions on 51 targets, 401 receiving yards, 1 receiving touchdown, was averaging 16.65 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format, and was the number 3 overall wide receiver only behind Calvin Ridley and Tyler Lockett at that point. He was averaging 12 targets, 9 receptions, and 100 receiving yards per game on that 4-game basis. In a full PPR, that's 19 points per game, just consistently racking in with the occasional touchdown 1 out of every 4 games. That's typically what Amari Cooper's been. He's never been a high touchdown guy. He's been an outside receiver that's just seen a lot of targets, and that was apparent last season to begin the year. Now, unfortunately, Dak Prescott against the New York Giants, week 5, ankle injury, boom, shattered, finished. And then it was pretty much the downhill slope that Amari Cooper faced. Despite all the odds stacked against Amari Cooper and the fact that Dak Prescott, the guy that was feeding him rocks and getting him to that wide receiver 1 potential every single year since coming to Dallas, was gone, he was still able to produce 11.01 fantasy points per game with Dalton, DiNucci, and Gilbert, and a backup offensive line, and Zeke hurt, and no one else doing anything on that defense. This team was a shell of itself last season. And I would say Amari Cooper was a shell of himself last season because He did deal with some injuries throughout the season. At the end of the year, fractured his ankle. But as a whole, Amari Cooper was still a viable 10-plus point wide receiver, regardless of who was at the quarterback position. I mean, he was able to do that with the Oakland Raiders when they were not that great of a team either. But now that you bring in Dak Prescott once again in 2021, you have Amari Cooper playing on the outside. I think they're going to potentially transition Ceedee Lamb on the other side of him and move Gallup into the slot position. We could end up seeing Amari Cooper get back to this 10-plus target range. I know his touchdown potential is not up there, and that's why I have him a little bit lower ranked. But I think he could very easily get back to 10-plus targets, getting himself 7 to 8 receptions a game, 75, 80 receiving yards in a contest. That is where I anticipate Amari Cooper to kind of sit at. And though the stats from weeks 1 through 4 of the 2020 season were inflated because there were absolute shootouts. When you're playing against Seattle and it's a 50 to 50 game, or Atlanta and Cleveland, these were games that were just complete shootouts and offensive barn burners. I think it may kind of inflate the statistics as a whole, but I still think that we'll see a little bit of regression, but enough consistency in which, in an offense that should be one of the better ones in fantasy football, I believe Amari Cooper could put together a very good 2021 season. Again, he finishes the number 16 overall wide receiver in 2020. I know that I have him at number 17. I anticipate a lot of wide receivers to improve from last season. I expect all the numbers to kind of rise, and I think Amari Cooper has himself a great year here in 2021. All right, we move on to our next wide receiver, another guy that I've talked about this offseason, Chris Godwin. Now, I talked about him at an expansive role in another video, the must-draft wide receivers of this upcoming season. Unfortunately, Chris Godwin dealt with a lot of injuries last year, finishing as the number 32 overall wide receiver based on the fact that he missed a lot of games. He only played 10 full games, but in those 10 games that he played, he averaged 14.77 fantasy points per game. Again, he dealt with concussion early, hamstring injury, and broke his finger and had to have surgery during the season. So on top of that, besides dealing with injuries, when he came back and he was healthy, once he rejoined the starting lineup in week 10 of the 2020 season, from between weeks 10 through 17, he was the number 13 overall wide receiver, and he was the number 14 overall wide receiver in terms of fantasy points averaged. So of course we know Chris Godwin in this offense should be a huge part, and he's going to be filling in that Julian Edelman role. I think I've mentioned this before. Julian Edelman and Tom Brady throwing the ball to the slot position, regardless of whether he was Wes Welker in the past, Danny Amendola, Tom Brady wants to pass the ball to the slot position. With another year under Tom Brady's belt in Tampa Bay, with more comfort with Chris Godwin and this entire offense, getting more comfort with Bruce Arians, Byron Leftwich, this offense is going to change. Brady's going to have a lot more input going into this upcoming season. And what we've seen from 2016 to 2019 with the New England Patriots, the way Tom Brady wanted it, they targeted Julian Edelman 9.54 times per game. I think that number could absolutely be something that Chris Godwin could attain this upcoming season. In fact, since 2019, Chris Godwin, when he's seen 7+ targets in games, he's averaged 18.3 fantasy points per game. There is a huge potential opportunity for Chris Godwin to take the next step. And I know there's a lot of mouths to feed in this offense. You already have Mike Evans, who we're going to mention later today in the video. We have Scotty Miller, Antonio Brown, Gronk. We have O.J. Howard. We have the 3 running backs, Ronald Jones, Leonard Fournette, Giovanni Bernard, Cameron Brate. There are so many receivers in this offense. I understand that. But even with only like 18 to 19% of the target share that he saw last season, I think he could very easily take those same numbers and put together a fantastic top 15 wide receiver performance this upcoming season, with the upside, of course, touchdowns being there. In an offense that likes to use 2 wide receivers minimum 96% of the time, and an offense that in the past 2 seasons has thrown the ball 628 times on average, I think this offense is going to take the next step this upcoming year. Chris Godwin's going to be a big part of that, and that's why I have him as my number 16. We can move on to our number 15 wide receiver, Robert Woods of the Los Angeles Rams. Like I mentioned with Cooper Kupp, the addition of Matthew Stafford in this offense makes a huge difference, and I think that we're going to see, of course, Robert Woods take that next step. But as of the last 3 fantasy football seasons, Robert Woods has been a fantastic overall wide receiver. In 2018, finishing as the number 10 overall wide receiver, then the number 17 overall wide receiver, then the number 13 this past season. So he has been on the cusp of finishing as a low-end wide receiver 1 or a mid-range wide receiver 2 for the last 3 consecutive seasons. You improve the offensive quarterback position, and perhaps the entire team improves as a whole, scoring more fantasy points coming in this direction. You don't have a guy like Todd Gurley eating 25 touchdowns. I don't think Darrell Henderson is getting that job done. So we're going to see more of an expansive role in which you're feeding more wide receivers touchdowns, and I think Robert Woods can certainly benefit from that this upcoming season. Now, last season with Jared Goff as the starting quarterback, he averaged 12.97 fantasy points per game. Though that's not the greatest number, For the past 3 seasons since 2018, he's averaged 13.15 fantasy points per game with Jared Goff. Now the question is, from the statistics that we've seen Robert Woods, the 13.15 fantasy point per game average, can he really expand upon that? Can his receiving yards, touchdowns, receptions, targets, can those numbers go up? Can we see more opportunity going in his direction? And can that really expand his role and his fantasy overall value? I think that's going to absolutely be the case. Like when we went and saw what the Rams did last year in comparison to the Detroit Lions, they ran their offenses very differently because Matthew Stafford is a gunslinger while Jared Goff is a game manager. He doesn't want to turn over the ball. He needs to play it safe, and they're just trying not to lose with him at the quarterback position. So when we look at what Robert Woods had last year, in total of only, I think, 5 end zone targets, in comparison with Matthew Stafford and what he did with his wide receivers, he had the 7th most end zone passing attempts in the entire National Football League last year amongst all quarterbacks. He had the 3rd most team air yards in terms of passing the ball, and the 11th most deep ball passing attempts, which is 20 plus yards. For being the number 1 outside wide receiver, I understand we're going to have Deshaun Jackson on the other side and Tutu Atwell. There are going to be other wide receivers that have speed, but Robert Woods is going to get open. Those guys are, in the rotation, and we're going to certainly see Robert Woods take that next step forward. When I look at what the number 1 wide receiver for the Detroit Lions has done for the last couple seasons, whether it was Marvin Jones or Kenny Golladay. I'm not going to count Calvin Johnson. That's just a complete different breed of player. But since 2015, the number 1 wide receiver for the Detroit Lions has averaged 118 targets, 73 receptions, 1,082 receiving yards, and 8 receiving touchdowns, which is 190 fantasy points. 190 fantasy points last season is about like the wide receiver 13.5 PPR scoring format. So though I expect Robert Woods to have even better numbers than that, and of course the entire wide receiver position as a whole to improve and have better numbers than that, I see him as the number 15 guy. I think he's got a lot of potential in this offense and a potential deep ball role being added to the resume of Robert Woods. I think we have a lot of potential for him this upcoming season. He's proven consistency, seen consistent numbers, and I think this upcoming season takes the next step. We move on to our number 14 overall wide receiver. We have Ceedee Lamb, the second Cowboys wide receiver we're going to see on today's episode, and the last one at that. Ceedee Lamb finishes the number 20 overall wide receiver last season. He was a great wide receiver, but the question is, what was he able to do with Dak Prescott that he wasn't able to do with the other quarterbacks? And why do I believe that because of that potential that we saw with Dak, can he have a fantastic 2021 season? That's the entire narrative. In the 4 full games that Ceedee Lamb played with Dak Prescott last season, he had a total of 412 receiving yards that led the entire team. On top of that, he had the most receptions of 15 plus receiving yards with 11, and he had the most end zone targets amongst all wide receivers on the team. And to take into account, he himself had 7 end zone targets, while the entire rest of the wide receiver core had 6 combined. Ceedee Lamb is going to catch the eye of Dak Prescott, and now that they've got him more comfortable outside of the slot position, they're going to move him to the outside, potentially move Gallup inside because of what we've seen in training camp all offseason. He has more comfort there. That means he's going to stay on the field even when they go to 2 wide receiver sets. I think Ceedee Lamb's going to expand his role. In the 5 games that they played together, we saw Dak Prescott and Ceedee Lamb be a fantastic combination. In fact, in that time, Ceedee Lamb was the number 12 overall wide receiver in fantasy, producing 14.22 fantasy points per game, and that was only in his rookie season, with no offseason, with no kind of chemistry being built outside of the couple practices per week, and of course, the Zoom meetings that they had to do every single week. Now that you have another season under his belt, and you have the experience being gained, and the comfort of this offense and how it's going to function, I think Ceedee Lamb absolutely makes that next step. And though I don't see him getting into the top 12 potentially this upcoming season, because there are a lot of other mouths to feed in this offense, with Zeke potentially catching the ball 50 times, Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, you get Blake Jarwin back this upcoming season, Dalton Schultz is still going to be involved. There are a lot of factors in this offense, and maybe it doesn't allow Ceedee Lamb to get to that next level unless the touchdowns are there, but he scored 5 touchdowns last season. And if the numbers that I've already mentioned, with end zone targets, with the ability to make 15 plus yard plays, deep ball accuracy of Dak Prescott, and the potential of Ceedee Lamb kind of expanding on the outside role, if we end up seeing a lot more deep passes in the direction of Ceedee Lamb, he could end up getting 7, 8, potentially double-digit receiving touchdowns this year. That would get him into that next conversation. Now, unfortunately, of course, we couldn't see more potential with Dak Prescott because they only played 5 games together until Dak Prescott, unfortunately, was injured. But after that, Ceedee Lamb was okay with DiNucci, Dalton, and Gilbert. He averaged 9.96 fantasy points per game and was the number 32 overall wide receiver throughout that stretch. Not great, but I honestly think with what we've seen this offseason already, with the fact that Amari Cooper has been kind of slow to come back and Ceedee Lamb has been the focal point of this offense, and many people are raving that he is the best receiver at camp, I think there's a very good potential that going from the number 20 wide receiver last year, we could end up seeing him in this top 15 conversation as my number 14. We move on to our next wide receiver. We have Diontae Johnson. You guys are probably wondering where I'm going to put him. I'm committing to my guy. I love Diontae Johnson this upcoming season. Opportunity is king in fantasy football, and especially at the wide receiver position. I know he burnt a lot of people. I know a lot of people talk about him dropping passes. Those are all things that I ignore because there are arguments 100% that snuff out the BS that I hear about Diontae Johnson every single day. Last season, in the 12 full games that he played, he averaged 14.05 fantasy points per game. In 11 of those 12 games, he had 10 plus targets. When he was targeted 10 plus times, including the playoff game against the Cleveland Browns, this guy's averaged 15.96 fantasy points per game. Outside of Keenan Allen and Davante Adams, no other wide receivers in the National Football League in 2020 had 10 plus targets more than 10 times. No other wide receivers. He joins great company with Keenan Allen and Davante Adams being guys that are perennial first team, all league wide receivers, and of course, top 12 fantasy wide receivers. So why not Diontae Johnson? I understand he dealt with injuries last year, and it did make a huge part of the fantasy community kind of turn their backs on him. And I know he dropped a couple passes on national television. Whoop-de-doo. He dropped 14 passes last year. You know who else dropped a bunch of passes? In the last 2 seasons alone combined, the 3 wide receivers that have led the drop category are Tyreek Hill, Stephon Diggs, and DK Metcalf. Yet nobody wants to talk about that. Diontae Johnson is being ignored despite the fact that the guy saw 28% of the target percentage in terms of total routes run to targets. 142 total routes run, 153 total targets. That's a 28.23% target percentage. On top of that, in terms of target share, the guy had 29.65% of it within his own respective team, in which we had Claypool and Juju Smith-Schuster, of course, getting themselves a lot of targets. So, when we talk about this offense, an offense that has thrown the ball more than anybody else in the National Football League in 2018 and in 2020 when Ben Roethlisberger has been the quarterback. A team that, yes, they bring in a running back and maybe they can get themselves a little bit more play action. Diontae Johnson should not be looked away from. The fact that he gets targets speaks volumes because targets are not accidental. Targets are not numbers that just are random. Targets happen when wide receivers get open. I have this exact same reaction when I talk about Tyler Lockett. The reason he had 132 targets last year wasn't because they were trying to force feed him. It's because he was getting open. When wide receivers are open, they're fed the ball. And when we have a wide receiver as talented as Diontae Johnson, who's able to score himself touchdowns down in the red zone and potentially grow upon last season and catch those passes that he dropped and stay healthy, we have ourselves a very valuable fantasy asset. Anyway, those are my thoughts on him. It was a little bit of a rant. I've talked about him as more of a expansive rate. If you go down to the description of the video or go to my channel specifically, you can find the video, of course, where he's on the thumbnail, and you'll hear more of my thoughts on him. Either way, we move on to Mike Evans, my number 12. The beginning of the top 12 here, we start with Mike Evans. Mike Evans sits at 12 because he's been one of the most consistent wide receivers in the National Football League, and he stays on a team that he's comfortable with in an offense that wants to throw the ball a bunch. I mentioned it with Chris Godwin. They have thrown the ball 628 times on average in the past 2 seasons alone. That's in the top 5 in the National Football League in terms of total passing attempts per offense. Now, the consistency we've seen from Mike Evans, it's undeniable. Since his rookie season in 2014, the guy has been a wide receiver 1 5 times. 3 of those 5 wide receiver 1 performances coming in the last 3 consecutive years between 2018 to 2020. On top of that, speaking of consecutive years, since coming into the league in 2017, Mike Evans has had 7 consecutive 1,000 receiving yard seasons. I mean, my goodness, the guy is just Mr. Consistency at the wide receiver position. And though we've seen Jameis Winston and all the inconsistencies there, now that we have the quarterback of the future for this team, or at least the foreseeable future until we end up seeing, of course, this 45-year-old man retire. He's so good. Mike Evans is in a very good spot. Though he saw the least amount of targets of his entire career in 2020, he was able to produce an incredible amount of receiving work down in the red zone. 19 targets for 9 receiving touchdowns. Of course, surpassed double-digit receiving touchdowns this past season. And though his overall productivity at times was underwhelming, I think there was a narrative behind that a lot of people are kind of brushing over, not even focusing on. Last season as a whole, from weeks 1 through 16, week 17 he played 11 offensive snaps because they didn't need to win that game. From weeks 1 through 16, he averaged 13.83 fantasy points per game. For a majority of the season, he didn't have Chris Godwin, Antonio Brown, Either one of Leonard Fournette or Ronald Jones was absent because of injuries. The offense was relying on Scotty Miller as the number 2 receiver. In the beginning of the 2020 season, again, this was a shaky start to an offense. I mean, they weren't winning that many games. They were having themselves some trouble, but it didn't take long. I mean, eventually when we got to week 9, from weeks 9 through 16, when we had Antonio Brown in the offense, Chris Godwin returned. We had Gronk firing on all cylinders. Both running backs were healthy. Tom Brady was feeling comfortable. That's when Mike Evans completely took off and got to the next level. And that you would kind of be surprised to think that that was potentially the case. You would think when there's no one else on the field and there's no other receiving options, he would be a better play. But in fact, it was the opposite. When there was more talent on the field, Mike Evans improved his play, averaged 16.67 fantasy points per game in that stretch between weeks 9 through 16 of last season, and was the number 6 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format throughout that span. And I understand you may be thinking there's a lot of mouths to feed. Is he going to potentially see 120 targets this year? When they throw the ball, 628 times a year on average, 120 targets, what is that, like 19% of the target share? We've seen him be able to produce with numbers like this in the past with Jameis, now with Tom Brady. I think the offense is going to improve an extra step this year, and though maybe we might see a little bit of touchdown regression, the yardages might go up, the targets might go up. We don't know what this offense has in store for us. Maybe they end up just completely torching the league or falling apart. But either way, the thing that I also wanted to mention in regards to Mike Evans is, of course, when you draft him, remember that Mike Evans, you can't play him the 2 weeks he plays against New Orleans. The guy averages less than 10 fantasy points against them in the past 2 seasons alone. But when you're playing against the Atlanta Falcons and the Panthers, whoo, baby. Last season against the Panthers and Falcons, he averaged 16.87 fantasy points per game. So take it into perspective. There are 2 sides of the coin when you play against the NFC South with Mike Evans. So just be careful there. Just putting that into perspective. Maybe Tom Brady could, fix that issue when they play against New Orleans. But either way, he's consistent, and I have a lot of confidence in him going into the season. We move on to our final wide receiver for today's episode. It is Allen Robinson. Now, I don't know if you guys have been watching earlier today. Before I started recording this video, I saw that Justin Fields was torching the Miami Dolphins defense. I know it was in the second quarter of the preseason, but Justin Fields looks like a promising quarterback. It probably is going to be the starter for week 1. Of course, they've invested in them. They drafted up and went ahead and grabbed him. But I just wanted to go ahead and put it in perspective as to what Allen Robinson has dealt with at the quarterback position and what Justin Fields could potentially mean for him this upcoming season. In Allen Robinson's career, he has played with Blake Bortles, Chad Henne, Mitchell Trubisky, Chase Daniel, and Nick Foles. Nick Foles, of course, maybe the best of the group, but in terms of the quarterback resume that Allen Robinson has played with, it's horrible. Yet, Allen Robinson has been a wide receiver 1 in 3 of his NFL seasons thus far. Going back to 2015 with the Jacksonville Jaguars, he finished as the number 6 overall wide receiver. And in back-to-back seasons here with the Chicago Bears, has been the number 12 and the number 11 overall wide receiver in a half PPR scoring format. Now we get ourselves a quarterback like Justin Fields, that though he's going to have his rookie mistakes here and there, is going to potentially be a far more significantly impactful quarterback for the potential of an Allen Robinson. Now let's talk about what Allen Robinson's been able to accomplish regardless of quarterback play in the last 2 seasons. From 2019 to 2020 with the Chicago Bears, in the 32 games that he's played, again, he hasn't missed a game in the last 2 seasons, he's averaged 13.05 fantasy points per game. Beautiful. But in the games that he's been targeted 8+ times, that's 21 of the 32 overall games, he's averaged 15.53 fantasy points per game. So opportunity, like I mentioned, leads to success. But targets hasn't been an issue for him. Again, 21 of 32 games, he's seen 8+ targets. The reason why that number exists is because in back-to-back seasons, he has seen over 150 total targets in the National Football League. To put it in perspective, there's only one other wide receiver in the NFL in the last 2 seasons that have seen more targets. That's DeAndre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins in the last 2 seasons has combined for 310 total targets, while of course Allen Robinson has seen 305. Everybody else, below them. Opportunity is going to be there for Allen Robinson. And I honestly might even move him up in my rankings in the coming days based on where this offense is going to go, whether they go Andy Dalton, Justin Fields. But I think with the potential that Allen Robinson has, being the number 1 wide receiver of the Bears, and in the last 2 seasons, he has shown his floor of productivity. I think he could even improve. We saw him, I think it was in 2015, with the Jacksonville Jaguars, like 1,400 receiving yards, double-digit touchdowns. I know it was all garbage time, but why not once again garbage time with the Bears? You can do that with a rookie quarterback very easily. I mean, just last season, in terms of total routes run to targets, he had a 24.16% target percentage and saw 24.79% of the team's total target share. This is a guy that's getting the ball in his direction one out of every 4 attempts from his respective quarterbacks. I think there's a very good opportunity for Allen Robinson to improve this upcoming season. In terms of his total opportunity in the red zone, that number could improve, but he's had himself opportunity. He's just got to deliver on it an extra step. In the last 2 seasons, he's had 20 targets for 6 receiving touchdowns and 19 targets for 4 receiving touchdowns. Another stat that I wanted to mention, it's actually pretty ridiculous. Last season, he had 12 games of 70-plus receiving yards. In a full PPR scoring format, a guy that's getting 150 targets and 100 catches a year, we're seeing him just put up passively good statistics as a floor. You add the touchdown potential this upcoming season, and we could end up seeing him having even better numbers. As a number 11 and 12 wide receiver, he has pretty much solidified that he is going to be a wide receiver 1, regardless of who's at the quarterback position. If he stays fully healthy, plays the full season, it's all his to take. Those are my 11 through 20 ranked wide receivers for the 2021 fantasy football season. Thank you everybody for watching. I appreciate the continued support. Again, if you like today's video in the rankings, click that like button, subscribe to the channel. Make sure that the bell notification is on to notify you when my latest video, of course, has released. And make sure you go down to the description of the video, join the free Discord server where we're talking fantasy football all day long. And if you want to take the next level, get my 2021 fantasy football draft guide. You can check out my Patreon down in the description. That releases this upcoming Monday. We have a lot of other things there, so go check it out. Again, your viewership is all that I need, but if you want to take that next level and support the channel even more to keep these lights on, they're very bright, I would really greatly appreciate that. Thank you very much, guys, and until tomorrow, I'll see you guys. Peace.